Hello, everyone. This is Fari, and I will be interviewing Professor Michael Chyet, who is working as a Middle Eastern cataloger at Library of Congress, and also in his spare time, he's teaching Kurdish, and he's a folk dancer, and he loves a lot of different folk music and dance from all over the world. So welcome to the program. Thank you for accepting this invitation, and let's start. So the first question, I'm pretty sure you got that a lot. How and why did you start to learn different languages? Because in America, we know in US, a lot of people, they unfortunately just speak one language. And it's not very common.
Dang Tay, can you hear my voice?
Yeah.
Thank you very much for the invitation. Let me start with my disclaimer. Everything that I say is my personal opinion and does not represent my employer, the Library of Congress. There. Now, I am from Cincinnati, Ohio. And when I was in the first grade, my neurotic and devoted Jewish parents were concerned that I seemed bored at the public school. So they took me to a psychologist, and he had me draw pictures. And apparently what the pictures told him was that I was bored. And so he advised them to take me out of the public school and put me in a private school. My father, who was an ordained Reform rabbi and a professor and historian at the Hebrew Union College in Cincinnati, Ohio. It was very important for him that I have a good Jewish education. So I was sent to a Hebrew day school in Cincinnati called Yavneh, Y-A-V-N-E-H, at age 6, about 4 weeks into first grade. And so I was introduced to my first foreign language, Hebrew, at that time. And I stayed in that school for 6 years, first grade through sixth grade. And then I went to the college preparatory high school in Cincinnati, Walnut Hills High School is what it's called. My mother had gone there too. And it was a 6-year, I think it still is a 6-year school, 7th through 12th grade. So in the 7th grade, everybody had to take Latin. And a lot of my classmates found it very difficult, but for some reason it came very easily to me. And so I already had English and Hebrew under my belt, and I was studying Latin. And that same year, I discovered in the attic books of my parents for studying, let's see, German and Yiddish and Spanish. And then I bought a book for studying French. And later on that year, I added Russian to the mix. So in 7th grade, I started, my interest in foreign languages was quite clear. And then in the 8th grade, my father took a sabbatical the second half of my 8th grade, January 1971 until the summer. And before we went on the trip, he and I were out walking Freckles the dog, I remember. And he said to me, "You like languages? We're going to Israel. There's another language spoken there besides Hebrew, Arabic." My father had studied a year of Quranic Arabic at Brandeis when he was an undergraduate. And so he said, Hebrew and Arabic are related Semitic languages. Since you already know Hebrew, Arabic should come easier to you and be more interesting to you than somebody who is coming at it cold. So he planted that idea in my head of studying Arabic, which first of all, I'm very proud of, that my father, the rabbi, encouraged me to study Arabic. So when we got to Israel in early January 1971. Pretty soon after we got there, well, I remember we went on a tour of Jericho one weekend, and I was so fascinated by what I saw there that the following day I went to a big bookstore in Jerusalem called Steimatsky's and bought my first Arabic textbook. And so Arabic is one of my first loves among languages. Because I already knew Hebrew, everything was as my father had said, came fairly easy to me. Like in every lesson, the vocabulary I would look through and say, that's like Hebrew, that's like Hebrew, that's like Hebrew. So then I only had to focus on the words that were new to me. And it worked very well. So my interest in the Middle East and Middle Eastern languages, well, I guess it starts with Hebrew when I was 6 years old, but then it was furthered with Arabic. And I also liked the sound of Arabic music. I remember the first time we went, we would, which was in the summer after I graduated from Yavne in 1968. We were just there for a month and a half or something like that. And I would hear a little bit of Arabic music on the radio, and I thought it was very interesting. But the songs tended to be sort of long. So when we came back for the sabbatical in 1971, one of the first things we did was turn on the radio, and they were singing a song, and my father jokingly said, "They're still singing that same song." So anyway, my interest in Middle Eastern music goes hand in hand with my interest in the language. And as I grew older and started learning more, so I eventually added Persian and Turkish to the mix. And I also became interested in folk dancing, first with Israeli folk dancing, and then I was really interested in the Arab style, Oriental style Israeli dances, the debkas and things, and the Yemenite dances and things like that. And then in 12th grade, I went a few times to international folk dancing on Friday nights at the University of Cincinnati. Now I've been folk dancing ever since then, like basically, I don't know, is that 40 years? Something like 45 years I've been folk dancing. And so I've added, from my knowledge of Russian, I've also added the South Slavic languages, Bulgarian, Serbo-Croatian, Macedonian, and well, also Greek and Romanian and some, I'm fiddling around with Albanian right now. But anyway, so from Hebrew to Arabic to Persian and Turkish, and then when I was a graduate student at UC Berkeley, University of California at Berkeley, I had just come back from living in an Arab village in Israel for 2 years on a program called Interns for Peace, which is designed to bring Jews and Palestinian Arabs together over common social projects. So first I got my BA in Arabic at UCLA, and then I went and lived in an Arab village for 2 years where I was able to use the language on a daily basis for 2 years. And I learned a lot about Arabic, the Arabic spoken language, and also about the folk expressions and customs and things like that. And that led me to realize that the word for what my passion is folklore. So I decided to go study with the American folklorist Alan Dundas at UC Berkeley, which is how I got there. So going to a university is expensive, and I wanted to get a scholarship if I could. So there was something called FLAS, Foreign Language Area Studies scholarships. And there was a great deal of competition for Arabic FLASs. So I thought, why don't I apply for a Turkish FLAS instead? I was the first person, at least at UC Berkeley, to do so, and I got it. And that meant that every semester I had to take a course in the Turkish language, in the language of the stipend. So for several years I did. So in addition to my interest in Arabic, I began focusing on Turkish and on Anatolia. And I already knew that I was interested in Kurdish because I liked I realized when I was an undergrad at UCLA, actually, that I was reading a folk dance description, and it said, this is a dance of the Kurdish minority in Eastern Turkey. And at the time I was, I don't know, 20, 21, something like that. And I remember thinking to myself, duh, you mean there's someone in Turkey besides the Turks? Now I laugh, but I realized that the davul zurna music that I'm passionate about was done largely by Kurds. So I made a beeline to the library looking for a textbook to study Kurdish. Well, I didn't find a textbook for Kurmanji. I did find a reference grammar for Kurmanji in French. And I found there was a textbook for Sorani in English from the University of Michigan. But I began to realize that there was relatively little in those days written in English about the Kurdish language and folklore and even history. And there was Mackenzie's Kurdish dialect studies that existed, but English was not a terribly important language for the study of Kurdish in those days. But I realized that all of the languages that I had studied as a kid, German and Russian and French, and as well as Turkish and Arabic, that there was a lot written about Kurdish in those languages, which, because I knew those languages, I was able to access. If I had only gone to Kurdish from English without knowing those other languages, I don't know what I would have done. But so this is partial answer to your question. But also, my friend and colleague Jafer Sheikh al-Islami at Carleton University in Ontario has he has given a talk and written about how Kurdish parents who are hesitant to have their children learn more than one language, thinking that that's going to limit their ability to study, he has a story for them, which is very different, which is the more languages you learn as a child, the easier it is going to be for you later on to learn other languages. So that, in other words, Kurdish parents should encourage their children should speak Kurdish to their children at home, obviously, but not be too worried if they're going to school and studying Turkish or Persian or Arabic, or in Europe, French or German or Swedish or English or whatever, as long as they're also speaking Kurdish at home. That way they'll have at least 2 languages under their belt. And I realized that what he was talking about, he was basically describing me and what happened to me, because I was introduced to Hebrew at a young age in 1st grade, and later in 7th grade, when I had to take Latin, it came easily to me and everything else. So I realized that I'm sort of like, without meaning to be, the poster boy for what Jafer Sheikh al-Islami was talking about.
Okay, thank you. So one of the questions, what challenges did you face while learning Kurdish? Because while you were learning Kurdish and you started in the 80s, I would say 80s, 90s, and when you started learning, 80s, when you started learning it was not a standardized language and it was banned language. It was illegal to speak. And what challenges did you face while learning Kurdish?
Just a minute. Yes, it was very challenging. The lack of a textbook was challenging. So now I've written a textbook, which I have used it in teaching. Hasn't been published yet because it's still a work in progress, but that was definitely a problem. And when I was in Turkey, having to pretend that I didn't know Kurdish certainly made it difficult to study. And I wondered if I was ever going to get to the point where I would attain any fluency in this language. I can't tell you the number of times, for instance, when I was a graduate student at Berkeley, when I would hear that that a Kurd had recently arrived, a new arrival had come to the Bay Area. So I went to meet the person thinking, maybe this is my chance to have somebody who I can practice with on a regular basis. And I would usually get the same song and dance. Well, I grew up in Istanbul or in Ankara or in Izmir or whatever. And I know a little bit of Kurdish, but really Turkish is the language that I know best. And I would find that over and over again. And then in 1992, for Nowruz, a Kurdish friend of mine from Kirkuk, so a Sorani speaker, said, for Nowruz, let's hop on a plane and go down to San Diego, which has a large Kurdish community. I'd always heard about it, but I didn't know anybody and I didn't know how to break into the community. So he said, let's go down and celebrate Nowruz with them and meet the community. So we did. And at that point, there were the second wave of Iraqi Kurds, people who had fled after Halabja and had spent 2 or 3 years in internment camps in Turkey, had just arrived in the United States. They'd come to San Diego and Nashville, which incidentally, if you didn't know, has the largest Kurdish community in North America, and Fargo and I think Dallas. But anyway, so San Diego was just an hour plane ride away from the Bay Area. So I went and I befriended a family from a village near Dohuk in Bahdinan in Iraqi Kurdistan. And they said, come back and visit us. So I took them at their word, and every month for the next 2 years, out of my own pocket, I would fly down there. A couple times on vacation, I would actually drive down, but I went down once a month for 2 years, and they introduced me around to the whole community. So finally, I had some native speakers of Kurmanji who I could speak with. And also, the Bahdini variety is different from a lot of the books that the Soviets had published and that existed were a very different dialect. So I was able to enlarge my knowledge of the language to include different dialects. But I had to do all of that on my own initiative and out of my own pocket. There was no existing textbook or course that would have provided that information for me. And again, a lot of the stuff was written in other languages, Russian, Arabic, Turkish, some in French, some in German.
Okay. So,
very little in.
Okay, thank you. So I understand that the first you start to learn Kurmanji, and when did you start to learn the other dialects? You are fluent in Kurmanji and Sorani, and you have very good knowledge on Zazaki, Haurami, and a little bit Kalhuri, probably.
I know my Kurmanji is definitely my best. Sorani is pretty good enough to teach it. And I've also written a textbook for that. So I think I had said that when I first went to the library at UCLA, there was a textbook for studying Sorani. So there's actually a five volume set. I don't know if you could see this right here.
Yep. Yeah.
And I would pick them occasionally at used bookstores. I would find one or another volume. So now I have the complete set. But that existed. And so I remember starting to look at the Sorani one before I went for a summer Turkish language course in Istanbul, which was the summer 1985. That was the summer that I began to study Kurmanji. But so I had a little bit of Sorani under my belt, and I was curious to see what the differences were anyway. But I basically decided when I was a graduate student at Berkeley, and it was so hard to find Kurmanji speakers, but there were Sorani speakers available. I decided I might as well focus on Sorani too. I might as well take advantage of the opportunity that I have here to study Sorani too. And at this point, I have to say that the more Kurmanji you know, the richer your Sorani is, and vice versa. Knowing one enriches your knowledge of the other. I had a friend, the same friend actually from Kirkuk, who suggested that we hop on the plane and go down to San Diego for Nowruz. His mother was visiting a long-term visit, and she didn't get along with his wife. So he had two houses, and he put his wife, he put his mother in a separate house to keep peace in the family. And she didn't know English. She only knew Sorani and Persian and Arabic and Turkmen and Kalhuri. She only knew 5 languages. I think she was illiterate, but she could speak 5 languages. So, and his wife was an American who only knew English. So anyway, I would go over and visit her. She had nobody to speak with, and she would sit there and you could say talk my ear off, but because I was studying Sorani at the time, for me, it was a gift to have her, to have her. She was telling me about how unhappy she had been in her marriage. She was telling me about problems with her husband, all of this stuff in Sorani. And I didn't understand every single word, but I understood a lot. And at the same time, she made this wonderful food. I mean, I was 20 something and I had an appetite. So it was a win-win situation. And I'm very glad that I took advantage of that instead of like holding off and only studying Kurmanji. I was able to further my Sorani too. And then eventually when I got the job as the editor of the Kurdish service at the Voice of America, 1995 to 2000, it really required somebody who knew both Kurmanji and Sorani anyway. And I had both of them. And then hearing both of them day in, day out for 5 years furthered my knowledge even more. Okay. I mean, today I tune in, I hear someone talking and it's familiar, I can follow it because I don't think there are any other places in North America where you could have that sort of exposure to Kurdish, and get paid for it.
Exactly. So what do you have to say for people who is learning Kurdish? Like, do you have any advice for them, or what should they do, or which dialect do you think they should learn?
Well, the first thing I ask anybody who says that they want to learn Kurdish is, what are you going to use it for? What country are you focusing on? What people, I mean, do you need Sorani or do you need Kurmanji? And I would definitely advise people, if you're interested in both, start with one, don't start with both. Just like if you're studying Armenian, you want to know both Eastern and Western, start with one. Your brain will explode if you if you deal with both of them, get a base in one and then expand from that. Don't try and do both at once. It's just, it's too confusing to be pulled in different directions like that. Choose one, but there's no right answer. Which one should people study? It's what you need. If you're going to be living in Suleymania, doing research on Kurdish folk music, then you obviously need Sorani. If you're going to be living in Eastern Turkey, Kurmanji is what you're going to need. So it depends on where you're going. But as with studying any language, if you take a course once a week and you only look at the book like 5 minutes before the class starts, you're cheating yourself. I mean, in order to learn a language, you need to do a little bit every day. Now, my father, when that summer in 1971, when we, not summer, the half-year sabbatical, when my father went to Israel, what he wanted to do was study modern Hebrew. He already knew biblical Hebrew. So he went to an ulpan, and from then on until for the rest of his life, every day he would find half an hour and he would read an article or a chapter in a book or whatever. He would read something in Hebrew. And like 10, 15, 20 years later, his Hebrew was so beautiful, so strong based on that. So my advice to anybody studying any language, not just Kurdish, is you're learning a civilization. You're not just learning a language. And your best bet is to do a little bit every day. If you only have a class once or twice a week, I would not say only do that one class and let that be it. I mean, also now today, with the internet, you can listen to spoken language. You can listen to television programs, news reports, singing. You can find dancing, everything at your fingertips without having to wait until you meet somebody. Like back in the old days before the internet, I was limited. I mean, I'm still glad that I went down to San Diego, but one doesn't have to do that today. And you can also find newspapers and news reports. So for the written form of the language on the internet. So on a daily basis. If you're doing that in addition to taking a course, then that's, then you'll benefit even more. But you're not going to wake up one day and miraculously know this language. You have to work. I have had to work for every word that I've learned. It takes a lot of work, and it requires dedication, and it requires stick-to-itiveness to learn any language.
Yep.
I mean, if you really want to learn it well and be able to understand when people speak at normal speed.
So another question, like, since you know a lot of languages and you are capable of comparing Kurdish to the other languages, so like, as you read a lot of articles about people claiming that Kurdish is primitive language, and those accusation or claim. So what do you think? What do you think about that claim? Do you think really Kurdish is a primitive language, or is very rich in vocabulary and everything?
What is a primitive language? I mean, what makes a language primitive? Kurdish has it's actually a language that is growing and expanding before our eyes. I mean, there are things, when I started studying Kurmanji and started putting together a dictionary, which was originally notes to teach myself the language. But it was very clear that there was a wall. This was Kurmanji and this was Sorani in, let's say, 1986 when I started studying. But in the 90s, in the early 90s, after the first Gulf War, when all of a sudden the blockade on the Kurdish language in Turkey was lifted, and there started to be a weekly newspaper, Welat, which later became Welat Temet, and then Azadiya Welat. And there started to be broadcasting in Kurdish, Kurmanji and Sorani, and a little bit in Zaza then, I guess, too. So people on opposite sides of the border, let's say the border between Turkey and Iraq, started to be in touch with each other and to be influenced by each other. So all of a sudden, words that in the 80s had been strictly Sorani words, not known or used by Kurmanji speakers, all of a sudden that started to change. And I realized that if my dictionary was going to be an accurate reflection of the Kurdish as it was used by its speakers, I had to add some of these words that were now in use. So for instance, the word for the press, publishing newspapers, media, and stuff like that. The word in Sorani, chapemeni, became a Kurmanji word in that period. And so Kurmanji words like heval and bezav, which have sound, which are very rare in Sorani, those words are now used regularly in Sorani. So in both directions, these things changed before our eyes, and it affected what I was doing with my dictionary. So I had, and I'm now I'm working on the third edition, but the second edition was published in January 2020, just in time for COVID to prevent me from promoting it. But there already are a fair number of those words in there. And now when I listen to Zoom sessions and programs on the computer, I hear all sorts of words that I know from, let's say, from Sorani that are being used in Kurmanji. And if these are native speakers, if they're using them, and I'm hearing a lot of the same words over and over, they obviously have caught on and are used now, at least by the group of Kurdish intellectuals who care about this language, care about its future, and are writing in it and speaking it and reading it. So I feel duty bound to include these words in my dictionary as well.
Okay, thank you. So how much do you think the oppressor's language has influenced Kurdish? Like, let's say you're going to Turkey, the oppressor's language is going to be Turkish, and in Iraq is going to be Arabic. And how much do you think the oppressor's language influenced Kurdish? And do you think is it negative way influencing or positive way? Like, if you
the fact that mother tongue education has not been permitted in Turkey and in Iran, and up till a couple of years ago in Syria, definitely can pose a threat to the future of Kurdish, which is what the governments of those countries want. My friend Bruce Togan, after whom I named the second edition of my dictionary because he died at age 46. His body was fished out of the ocean near Calais, France. He was from Julemerg, from Hakkari, which is the part of Kurdistan of Turkey where Iran, Iraq, and Turkey meet. The capital of that province is the town of Julemerg. And he, for many years, he was a journalist, and he escaped just barely with his life came to the United States, and I was very lucky and honored to be able to hire him for the Voice of America's Kurdish service, which up to then didn't have any Kurds from Turkey at all. Imagine the largest part of Kurdistan, and the Voice of America only had Kurds from the various squabbling parties from Iraqi Kurdistan and one or two Kurds from Iranian Kurdistan, none from Syria and none from Turkey. So as soon as I got there, I said, the first thing I'm going to do is change that. So I hired him. And so my point was, when he was finally able, many years later, after he married a Kurdish woman in France, and he had always said he's going to marry a Kurdish woman and speak Kurdish with his children, not Turkish. So he did that, and he was able to go back with his family to Kurdistan of Turkey for the summer a couple of times. And when he came back, he contacted me and he said, Michael, Julemerg Hakkari used to be like the symbol of Kurdishness. But you walk down the street there today and you hear little kids talking to each other in Turkish, not in Kurdish. And if in an area like Hakkari, like Julemerg, that's the case, that is a very serious threat to the future of Kurdish. The thing is, it's the parents of these children who need to understand the responsibility that they bear for passing on this language to the next generation. And I think a lot of people have this smart-ass attitude. There are millions of us. If I don't pass it on to the next generation, someone else will. Well, there's a story which I've a folk tale from Europe, which I've translated into Kurdish, and I am going to take the opportunity to here, if I may, to share it with you. Yeah. So, a king proclaimed that he wanted to have a festival in his kingdom, and he wanted to build a new fountain, and he wanted, instead of water, he wanted wine to flow from the fountain. And there were 40 vintners in his realm, and he tasked his 40 vintners to provide the wine for this wine fountain. Well, each vintner said, well, you know, there are 39 other vintners. If I slip in water instead of wine, nobody will notice the difference, right? So the day of the opening of celebration, they turn on the fountain, nothing but water came out, because all 40 of them had the same idea. Everyone passed the buck to somebody else. So, I mean, that's a language can die out very quickly. I mean, millions of speakers, then thousands of speakers, then hundreds of speakers, then the last 5 speakers, and then the last speaker of the language died last month. I mean, this is the story with several of the Native American languages in North America.
Unfortunately.
And particularly the largest part of Kurdistan, which is Kurdistan of Turkey, is threatened that way. But it's the message to children is the message to their parents. My drushim, my slogan is, a language not spoken by children has no future. Zmane kuzarok pe nepeyevin be pasheroja. And I can't tell you how many times I have had the conversation with Kurdish nationalists from all 4 parts of Kurdistan. You ask them, do you speak Kurdish to your children at home? And from all 4 parts of Kurdistan, I've heard this song and dance, some excuse. Why not? Why? Well, my wife is an Arab or a Turk, or it's just, I mean, I think that's they're speaking out of both sides of their mouth at the same time. If you're really devoted to this cause, it's got to be with every fiber of your being, and it's got to mean caring about the future of this language, and that means ensuring that there is a younger generation that knows the language, and not just like Sunday school, a couple of words. I'm talking about to be functional in the language. And when people have to flee and they transplant the family to whether it's Europe or the United States, I'm glad that they have a Kurdish language educational system for kids in Germany and in Sweden. But I have spoken with kids who are products of that. And they know, like I know a family, the kids speak, they live in Sweden, the kids speak English without an accent, and they speak Swedish, and they can speak Kurdish at home, but the first sentence that one of them said to me had a grammatical error in it. And I mean, this is a product of several years of the Kurdish educational system in that country, in Sweden. So I think a lot of people just don't take it seriously. I mean, what's going to happen in 20 years? What's going to happen in 40 years? The point that we now have Zoom, so a lot of education is on Zoom anyway. This is a golden opportunity for a Kurdish educational system, and I mean a standardized one where kids in all 4 parts of Kurdistan are getting the same education. Because my dream is that all Kurdish children should be taught both Kurmanji and Sorani, and in both the Latin and the Arabic orthography. Because if you grow up with both alphabets, then it's part of you. You hear Kurds in Turkey who only know the Latin alphabet, thinking that everybody else should drop the Arabic alphabet and pick up the Latin alphabet. Well, how's that going to happen? First of all, 100 years ago, everywhere the Arabic alphabet was in use. And for if you want to be able to read historical texts, you need to know the Arabic alphabet. That's number one. I mean, Ataturk decided to cut off the people of Turkey from their past. That's part of why he switched to the Latin alphabet, so the people couldn't read stuff in the past. Well, for the Kurds, they don't want to be cut off from the past. They want to be a link with the past. So it's very important to do that. And also, realistically, half of Kurdistan uses the Arabic alphabet. Kurdistan of Iran, Rojhelat, the east, and Kurdistan, central Kurdistan, which people call southern Kurdistan, Bashur. Really, southern Kurdistan is Kermanshah, as far as I'm concerned. But this is this Turco-centric idea, which it's to the south of Turkey. Anyway, that's a different issue. But in those areas, it's the Arabic alphabet that people function in. So if you teach, instead of choosing one, if everybody is taught both, and eventually, if they all decide that they want to go with one alphabet or the other, that will be their decision.
It's like Serbian. Like Serbian. It's like Serbian. Serbian, they grew up with 2 alphabets.
Yeah.
And I'm pretty sure I think they're now choosing Latin more. They're using Latin more than the other.
Well, in Bosnia, which, let's not get into the issue of the fact that Serbian, Croatian, and Bosnian are all one language. Mm-hmm. Let's not get into that. But there is a simple one-on-one correspondence between the Latin and Cyrillic alphabet for Serbo-Croatian, just as there's a simple one-on-one correspondence between the Latin and Arabic alphabet for Kurdish, as well as the Cyrillic alphabet for Kurdish as it was written in the Soviet period. That's largely already switched over to the Latin alphabet there. But rather, I think it's very important. This is not just a linguistic issue, it's a social issue. We want Kurdistan to be an area which has a social, the words are failing me as usual when I need them. I don't want Kurdistan to become like South Sudan. Yes, South Sudan is independent, but at what cost? And now everybody has to flee because otherwise they're going to get killed. I don't want that. I want better than that for the Kurds. And the point is, because of the reality that there are several different dialects and varieties of Kurdish, rather than shoving one down the throats of everyone else, at this point, I think it's important for people to have, to be imbued with a feeling of curiosity and tolerance towards the other dialects, and not feel that mine is superior and anyone who doesn't speak mine is inferior. And that's not the way that you have peaceful coexistence and a bright future. So I think that Kurmanji and Sorani, as well as Zaza and Haurami and Kalhuri, minority dialects, as well as the Neo-Aramaic, modern Syriac dialects spoken by the Christian minorities. The Jews have just about all, are all, excepting in Iranian Kurdistan a little bit, they've all emigrated to Israel. And they have not passed on their Neo-Aramaic language to the younger generation. They've all switched it with Hebrew, which is very unfortunate, because that language is also, and that's an important language of Kurdistan. It's also threatened with demise.
So what do you have any advice for Kurdish people about the Kurdish language? I know you partially answered that, like, what do you think they should do? Like, I know a lot of Kurds, they come into the United States, they totally forget about the Kurdish. And in Europe, unfortunately, the Kurdish is losing ground, and a lot of people, they're choosing their oppressor's language, especially the Kurds from northern Kurdistan, who would say like Kurdistan of Turkey. So they are not speaking that, like, even they are in the, like, they say we're still being oppressed and everything, but in reality, they're not oppressed. They're in Europe. They have freedom and everything, but they are not choosing the language. Do you have any message for them or any advice?
Without the language, there is no Kurdish culture. Do they want there to be a Kurdish culture or not? Or do they just want to have the big bucks and live like the rest of?
And unfortunately, a lot of them, they say once we have the country, free country, we can start to working on our language and
well, in other words, they don't want it to happen. I'll give you an example. Now, I think that understanding between the Jews and the Palestinians is very important. So I want to make that clear. But in Hebrew had died out as a spoken language for 2,000 years. It's the only language in the history of humanity that has successfully been revived as a spoken language. And that happened because a small number of very dedicated Jews from Eastern Europe decided at the beginning of the 20th century to emigrate to Palestine and to speak to their children in Hebrew. Now, these were people whose native language was Yiddish, maybe Polish, maybe Russian, maybe German in some cases. But they knew, they had a good reading knowledge of Hebrew because of the Haskalah. There were these high schools in Eastern Europe where one could study Hebrew, but to speak it, it took a great deal of discipline and a strong resolve. And at first it was a very small group. And nobody knew that in 1948, the state of Israel was going to be officially recognized. So they were not doing that with a guarantee of anything. But by the time 1948 came around, there were maybe 3 generations of native speakers, a small number, but still people who were speaking it and who could then be teachers to more people who were coming to the country and learning the language. So for people who say, first, let's establish a Kurdish country and then we'll deal with education, that's not the way things go. That means that we don't know, we have no guarantee that that's ever going to happen. If you're going to wait till that, by then the language will have died out. So I think that people need to make a decision. Do they care? Are they proud of being Kurdish? Do they want their children to preserve the language? Do they want the future to have, do they want the language to have a future? If they do, then there are certain things that they're going to have to do. And for instance, in the Middle East, what the father says goes. So let's use that for something positive. And why don't the fathers say, in my household, within these 4 walls, the language is Kurdish. If you want to speak Turkish, Arabic, Persian out on the street, that's your business. When you come home in this house, we're speaking Kurdish. That instead of allowing Devlet Baba, the government, to decide what they're going to be doing in their own home, use this paternal authority. There's another word for it, but my shrunken brain can't think what the word is. Patriarchy. There it is, patriarchy, which is actually a Greek word. But anyway, use that for something good for a change. That's my opinion.
Okay.
As bad.
Thank you very, very much. Galak spas mali ava. I really appreciate for you to come and talk about your experience with the Kurdish language and in languages in general, to be honest. And I'm really lucky that I know you, and I'm really happy that you accept our invitation and you came and you talked to us. I really appreciate it.
Well, and you're one of my teachers. I learned so much from you in our weekly talks on Skype. And I'm very proud of you for what you've done. And I hope that Kurdish Cultural Month is a success. And I'm hoping there's going to be another film festival coming up. And please keep me apprised of what's happening.
Definitely. Thank you very much.
Sure. Thank you. Thanks for the invitation.